So this was already done.
You can leave it on.
If it was, let's say, this far,
okay, so
it wouldn't be would it be catching it this far?
No, not really.
Okay, so I'll let them know it's on. Dankeschön. Okay. Yeah, on. You can keep it on. If it's about this far, it's not catching. There we go. So you want me to leave it?
Yeah, I think it will be for us.
So I was taking care of
Testing. 1, 2, 1, 2. Check, check, check. Also, das war nicht. Check, check. 1, 2. 1, 2.
did Andre go? Okay, my name is Aki Kachi. Thank you very much for coming to our side event on environmental integrity and sort of a civil society vision for Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. It's always hard to schedule these things around negotiations and various other side events, so we're very glad to have you here. I'm the International Policy Director at Carbon Market Watch for a think tank NGO based in Brussels, focusing on the UNFCCC, the ICAO process with Corsia in Montreal, and working on the EU ETS. Today we will be having a number of interventions. We'll start with an overview of parties' views on Article 6, so the various submissions that have been submitted from Wolfgang Sterk, from the Wuppertal Institute. We'll then have a presentation of research on sort of lessons to be learned regarding sustainable development from the CDM, from Karen Holm Olsen from the Danish Technical University. We'll then have a presentation of studies, or a study done in part by Stephanie Hoz Theuer, who's now an independent expert working on climate change. She was previously with the Secretariat. And then a short presentation by Juliane Voigt, our Sustainable Development Policy Officer at Carbon Market Watch. And then we've invited a couple of negotiators to give their initial reactions. So André Marcoux, who's here on behalf of Panama, and MJ Mace from St. Lucia, sometimes AOSIS, sometimes various other affiliations. And I'm hoping that Sven Braden from Liechtenstein, EIG, will be joining us shortly. Andre, do you have a question?
No.
No? Okay. So without further ado, Wolfgang, if you can start us off.
Working? Standing up? Yeah. So, microphone would probably be helpful as well. Yeah. So, as Aki just said, my presentation is based on the submissions by parties on Article 6. So I don't, as humble observers like myself, were not allowed to be present in the negotiations. I don't know whether anything happened there that contradicts what I'm going to say based on the submissions. But if anything of that sort did happen in the negotiations, I'll be happy to have that pointed out to me by those who are in a better position than myself. So I'm not, due to the limits of time we and I have available here, I'm not going to go through all the issues. I was asked to focus on 3 of them. First is central oversight, the second is environmental integrity, and the third one is sustainable development. So, central oversight, as far as I see, has been a central controversy on the development of new mechanisms for quite a number of years. Pre-Paris already, we had these discussions about, we had this controversy leading to a bifurcation into on the one hand, framework for various approaches, on the other hand, a new market mechanism, where the new market mechanism was supposed to have central governance, and the framework for various approaches was supposed to open space for bottom-up. And now we essentially have the same concepts here in Article 6.2 and 6.4. 6.4 centrally governed mechanism, and 6.2 subject, at least as far as the Paris Agreement says, subject to guidance. But nonetheless, there's still quite a lot of controversy about what exactly that is supposed to mean, with 2 camps opposing each other. On the one hand, a camp that says that reads 6.2 as saying that it's the prerogative of parties to generate, transfer, and use ITMOs, and that the guidance should really be restricted only to accounting issues, but not be concerned with the generation of units. And on the other hand, we have the camp that says that we need a centralized international oversight over all units generated under the UNFCCC, not only 6.4, but also 6.2. And there's also some suggestion in some of the submissions that the governing mechanism, governing body could be the same for all of the approaches under Article 6, with separate windows for the different approaches, but one body responsible for all of Article 6. Then next, environmental integrity. A big issue in Article 6, but not really clearly defined what exactly that is supposed to mean, as some of the submissions also point out. We have the ambition there that environmental integrity is to be maintained, but not really a clear definition of what exactly that is supposed to mean. In most submissions, there is explicitly or implicitly an understanding that environmental integrity means that 1 carbon unit represents 1 ton of CO2 reduced and is counted only once towards a commitment. And one submission posits that one should also look at potential other conflicts with other environmental related aspects, for example, biodiversity. With this understanding, a ton is a ton. There's, of course, all the accounting issues, which I'm not going into here due to limited time. But some submissions also posit that in addition to robust accounting, further safeguards are needed to ensure environmental integrity. Some submissions suggest that parties that want to participate in Article 6.2 should have multi-annual emission budgets, so basically the same approach as under the Kyoto Protocol. And they make this demand to be able to do robust accounting in the first place. But there's also quite a number of other parties who demand that use of Article 6 should be open to all parties with all types of NDCs. So there should be no discrimination on the basis of types of NDCs. Then there's some suggestion that maybe eligibility of sectors to be used should be limited to sectors that are easily quantifiable and where lasting emission reductions can be achieved. Then there's some suggestion that units should be automatically cancelled after some time if they are not used towards NDC achievement. So after 5 years, for example, is one suggestion. And there's also a suggestion to limit the share of NDC achievement that can be used using transfers, which under the Kyoto Protocol is known as supplementarity. And I personally was quite surprised to see that, if I saw correctly, there's only one submission which talks about the risk of overselling. So that a country may sell more emission reductions than it would actually be able to for achieving its own NDC. And I think that risk is rather acute, given that under the Paris Agreement there's not really an obligation to actually achieve NDCs, different from the Kyoto Protocol. So I was surprised to see that only one submission was talking about this issue. So this is then me going further into personal opinion mode. As I said, I don't know what's been happening in the discussions, but from the submissions, I think there's a rather limited view of environmental integrity so far. I think there's 2 dimensions really under the new structure of the Paris Agreement, which we in the Wuppertal Institute have tried to coin static challenge and dynamic challenge. So the static challenge is what most talk about in the submissions, to make sure about the integrity of the individual transactions, which one could phrase as making sure that globally there will be no more emissions than there would have been if the transaction did not exist. But I think there's also a dynamic challenge to ensure that a use of Article 6 does not undermine ambition in subsequent NDC periods, because as we have seen under the Kyoto Protocol, there is an incentive to keep targets weak in order to maximize the potential to sell emission reductions or supposed emission reductions. And there's also a risk to keep the coverage of NDCs narrow in order to be able to sell mitigation outcomes from outside the NDC. So which one could maybe call making sure that there are no more emissions globally than there would be if Article 6 as a whole did not exist. To safeguard against that kind of risk, I think the mandate in Article 6 that all use of Article 6 has to have the objective of raising ambition of climate action is really crucial to preserve the environmental integrity of the Paris Agreement as a whole. In terms of raising ambition, so that's in there as Article 6 as a key objective, but it's not talked about in all of the submissions, really. And a couple of submissions just assume that more or less Article 6 will by itself lead to possibilities to increasing emission, because it will give parties more flexibility to assess inexpensive emission reduction potential, etc. But there are also some submissions that have the view that ambition really needs to be built into the mechanisms to make sure that this objective is being fulfilled. So suggestions include that eligibility for transfers should be limited to absolute emission reductions. So there would not be a possibility to have reductions from business as usual transferred, but only if emissions really go down. Then there is a suggestion to make Article 6.4 in particular a tool for voluntary action by the private sector. Various submissions suggest that emission reductions should be discounted in order to achieve a total mitigation benefit. Then there's one submission suggesting that use of Article 6 should be included in the global stocktake to assess whether Article 6 is indeed being used to enhance ambition, and that countries which cannot show that they're using Article 6 to enhance ambition should be excluded from Article 6 use in then subsequent NDC periods. Then there is suggestions to manage the supply of units to prevent a repetition of what we've seen in the CDM, oversupply leading to prices crashing. And then there's also one suggestion that corresponding adjustments should not only be made for mitigation outcomes from within the NDC, but also for mitigation outcomes that come from outside an NDC. And the aim of this suggestion is to remove the incentive to keep the scope of NDCs narrow. So then the final issue I'm going to talk about, sustainable development in Article 6. Also a very long-standing controversy in the CDM already, which, similar to 6.4, has the mandate to promote sustainable development. But there's been a long-standing controversy on whether there should be any international provisions on this, or whether it should be left to the host countries. And we see this clash of positions again in the submissions. But there's also some intermediate suggestions. One suggestion is, while countries would be left to define their own criteria, they should be required to have criteria in the first place and procedures and to internationally notify those. Then another suggestion is, goes even further, that countries should be required to demonstrate how their use of Article 6 is contributing to sustainable development. And another suggestion, which could be aligned with the previous one, is that countries should be required to report under Article 13 how their use of Article 6 is promoting sustainable development. Then there's a suggestion to have, well, not a mandatory tool, because that is suggested, rejected by almost everyone in the submissions which talk about this issue. But there's some openness by some submissions to have a voluntary tool to aid countries and participants in identifying sustainable development issues. Another similar suggestion is that maybe minimum criteria could be identified internationally, but parties would be free to use them differently. And for many of these things, parties suggest that the Sustainable Development Goals should be used as basis for defining criteria of what constitutes sustainable development. And in a, I think, very related issue, there's also some suggestions that parties should be required to demonstrate how the activities under Article 6 are respecting, promoting, and considering obligations on human rights in line with the preamble of the Paris Agreement. So that's it from my side for the moment. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Wolfgang. So a number of views, and ending on sort of various views on sustainable development. I think that's a very smooth transition into our next presentation. Karen.
I will follow Wolfgang's example and stand here so I can see the slides. My name is Karen Olsen from UNFCCC Partnership, and what I will talk about is a piece of research building on many years of experience with the CDM Sustainable Development Tool, and it's a piece of research done together with the Wuppertal Institute that Wolfgang comes from, and that particularly Christoph sitting here that we've been doing together. First, I'll give the background on what are the SD provisions in Article 6 and how can experience from the CDM be relevant. Make recommendations for primarily for improvement of the CDM SD tool, but then discussing how that can be relevant in context of Article 6 mechanisms, all of them. And at the end, some conclusions. First, as background, I'd like to draw your attention to the difference between the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol. And one obvious difference is that if you count how many times sustainable development is mentioned in the Kyoto Protocol, it's, I think it's 6. I've made a mistake here. I think it's 6 times. But in the Paris Agreement, it's 22 times. And when you look at how sustainable development is framed, is in the Kyoto Protocol compared to the Paris Agreement, it's also quite different. In the Kyoto Protocol, it was an obstacle. Climate mitigation was an obstacle to mitigation. And I think in the Paris Agreement, we're moving towards, with the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, towards a framing where sustainable development is rather seen as a leverage for mitigation actions. When you look into the mechanisms, Article 6 in the Kyoto Protocol compared to Article 7 in the Paris Agreement, the language is almost exactly the same, but again, the framing is slightly different, and that potentially has some very significant implications for how the rule book of Article 6 will be developed. The negotiators know much more about this, and as we just heard from Wolfgang, it's this is my personal view, the barriers to promoting sustainable development in the new Article 6 are more of a political nature than technical. But just to draw out the differences, particularly in Article 6, we have the chapeau 6.1 says that sustainable development, higher ambition, environmental integrity are principles for all three mechanisms, particularly for the Article 6.4, which some people call the CDM+, other calls it the Sustainable Development Mechanism. There is a language in the Paris decision that rules, modalities, and procedures will be adopted by the CMA, or the parties, on the basis of real, measurable, and long-term benefits related to the mitigation of climate change. The mechanism has a double aim of both contributing to mitigation and sustainable development, so benefits applies to both. I know that this is my interpretation, that others read that text differently, but to me it looks like there is a mandate that we should measure the benefits for sustainable development in Article 6. How that gets done is not decided yet. But learning from the CDM SD tool, we did, based on a research project for the German government some years back, 3 reports, mapping the indicators, assessing usefulness to stakeholders, and proposing recommendations for a reformed CDM SD tool. And summarizing, synthesizing insights, we compared the CDM SD tool together with other mechanisms and approaches to sustainability assessment based on the needs for sustainable development assessment on the left column. And let's not go into the details here. Maybe you can just say there's one tick on what the indicators for sustainable development, the tool has that, but on all the other needs for sustainable development assessment, the tool does not have that. So in other words, when you compare the SD tool with other mechanisms, there are a lot of shortcomings. The main ones being that it does not assess negative impacts. There are also no safeguards against negative impacts. There are no requirements for monitoring and evaluation. The stakeholder consultation process is disconnected for sustainable development. And there's no grievance mechanism. So obviously, if you compare to the other mechanisms we assessed against, a starting point is to include this and strengthen the tool. So we also compared with stakeholder needs, with doing interviews and assessments of how stakeholders found the tool useful. First of all, it's not a tool for the designated national authorities of CDM. It's a tool for project proponents that they can use voluntarily. There was an evaluation in 2014 which found that most DNAs would like to refer to it, make use of it, for approval of CDM projects at national level. This was 92%, so which was actually a little surprising compared to the politics of, as we just heard from Wolfgang, that some parties don't want any international guidance at all on this issue. The tool is similar to a checklist approach that most host countries use. We identified an emerging interest to quantify the sustainable development outcomes. From the perspective of users, they found this qualitative tool very simple and useful, but also that these weaknesses were identified that I just mentioned. And some of the demand for such a voluntary tool has been that project proponents, buyers find that the national standards fall short of expectations. That this is a yes or no, there's a contribution, but we actually don't know if they say yes, what is it? So recommendations for improvement, we split it up into 2 levels. Incremental improvements, mainly addressing the shortcomings, and then institutional enhancements, which would go further, addressing more needs than that were identified by stakeholders. Okay, maybe I should just, I think that the incremental improvements, this is identifying and making up for the shortcomings by putting in place safeguards reporting, monitoring guidelines, independent validation verification, and linking stakeholder requirements to use of the tool. And going further, the institutional enhancements would be to introduce certification voluntarily again from the international level, and also to create a standard for quantification for those that would like that. Similar to how methodologies for emission reductions are developed. And discussing these opportunities for improvement in context of Article 6 and the issues and concerns that are seen in the submissions. We've seen objections to promoting stronger sustainable development provisions, is that we don't have a clear definition. This is something parties decide for themselves, which means there would be 200 different definitions almost. So that makes it difficult for anything at international level if it's decided very differently at the national level. There's the host country prerogative. Then there's the fear that the market would not be able to handle a price mechanism based on sustainable development benefits also, and that it would be too complex and costly to quantify and assess sustainable development benefits. And there are many other, you could describe this in many other ways. We picked 4 issues, but you could identify other barriers, more barriers. So the outlook from the Kyoto or the CDM towards the post-Paris architecture that's being developed. What we have is the CDM Sustainable Development Tool from the Kyoto period. It came late, but it's there now. And now we also have the Sustainable Development Goals, and we see in the submissions that there's enhanced interest in building indicator frameworks on the 2030 agenda for the Global Sustainable Development Goals. The CDM SD tool shows that it's possible to set some robust standards, and that linking and harmonizing these experiences with the emerging mechanisms Article 6 is an option. Part of the incentive for doing so is that linking with the SDGs can also leverage additional finance from the development community towards the mitigation actions. So in conclusion, the Article 6 provides a political mandate to measure the sustainable development impacts, that they should also be real, measurable, and long-term. Building sustainable development assessment for Article 6 and 6.4 in particular, where there is a mandate for international oversight, is a first step. And that harmonization of sustainable development methods, some common ground, for instance, using the SDG indicators, that's again a personal view, is advisable. That could help developing a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom, as we saw in CDM. And that this experience can help lay down some international best practice for Article 6. Thanks.
Wonderful. So we're a bit behind on time. We started a bit late, but I wanted to make absolutely sure that we also cover the various threats to environmental integrity. We'll hear from Stephanie.
I'll have to sit because I have notes and I strategically sat next to the computer so I can see my presentation. Everybody can hear me? Okay. So hello everyone and thank you for coming. My name is Stephanie. As Aki mentioned, I'll be talking to you today about hot air and environmental integrity more broadly within Article 6. And I would like to leave you today with 3 messages. Oh, I have this thing. cute animations aren't working. Okay, so the first message is that we should ensure very simply that Article 6 does not lead to an increase in global GHG emissions compared to a situation where Article 6 does not exist or where international transfers don't take place. The second message is that robust accounting is very important for environmental integrity, but it is not enough to ensure environmental integrity. And think about Kyoto, for example. It had very good accounting. It still has pretty good accounting. It's not perfect, but it's there. And we still have lots of hot air problems, right? So under Article 6, we have, in the study I'll introduce to you soon, we've identified 2 key risks to environmental integrity that need to be addressed. One is hot air, so surplus units from NDCs that are less ambitious, less stringent than NDC, and the crediting of emission sources outside the scope of NDCs. The third message that I want to leave you with is that solutions do exist for these problems, but we basically can't have the cake and eat it too. And there is a fundamental trade-off between ex-ante assurance of environmental integrity and a high level of decentralization and flexibility for parties in the implementation of Article 6. So I'm going to, oh, well, that clearly didn't work. I'm done. That was quick. Okay, just a second. Maybe if I do it this way. Ha, okay. So I'll take you through those 3 key messages in 3 steps. First, we'll look into what environmental integrity is, how it's defined, what factors influence it. Then we'll look into some of the numbers for the risks that I've highlighted, and then we'll look into solutions. Now, there's really a lot to be said environmental integrity. I could stay here and talk until the cows go to sleep, but we certainly don't want that. But you can look at this paper, which was published by the German government a few weeks ago, which I've co-authored, which goes into a lot of detail on all of the issues that I'll be covering here today. You can get it from the site events page, and there will also be a link at the end of the presentation. Okay, so what is environmental integrity? And as Wolfgang mentioned, this is funnily enough not defined anywhere in UNFCCC. And indeed, some parties do regard environmental integrity in a broad context, looking, for example, into impacts on biodiversity. But the prevalent view among parties and in the literature really is to look at environmental integrity of carbon markets in the context of greenhouse gas emissions. So in the study, we understand that environmental integrity means that the use of international transfers does not lead to higher global GHG emissions compared to a situation where targets had been achieved, but only through domestic mitigation action. And now, it is important here to note something that Wolfgang also mentioned, the implicit assumption that countries will actually achieve their targets. Because if countries don't have to achieve their targets and they can oversell units as much as they want, basically what you have is a market without scarcity, which clearly can't work very well. So with this definition in hand and with these assumptions in hand, in the study we identified 4 key factors that influence the environmental integrity of Article 6. The first is about accounting, and we know about this, right? This is about quantifying NDCs, addressing single-year targets, corresponding adjustments, and so on and so forth. A lot has been said about this. The second one is about the quality of units, and here we understand the quality of units as generated by underlying mechanisms, so as generated by crediting mechanisms, by emission trading schemes, and even by schemes that allow for government-to-government bilateral transfers, like Article 17 of the Kyoto Protocol. And some countries regard Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement to be very similar to Article 17 of the Kyoto Protocol. So we understand unit quality to mean that a unit that has a face value of 1 ton actually is directly related to an abatement of at least 1 ton. And I understand this is quite similar to the concept of mitigation value that Andrei might be talking about later, but I think some important differences are there. So in the context of crediting mechanisms, ensuring unit quality means making sure that the activity being credited is additional, is not overestimated, that permanence is addressed. For emission trading schemes, this is about having a cap such that losing or internationally transferring a unit from that pool of units within that cap leads to a scarcity that leads to an abatement of at least 1 ton, right? In government-to-government transfers, it's a little bit more complicated, but it's very similar. If you're transferring in government-to-government transfers a unit that pertains to a specific abatement activity, then basically you're talking about crediting. If you're transferring a unit from a pool of units, then you're basically talking about emission, the safeguards that you would need for emission trading schemes. So the third element is the ambition and the scope of the NDCs. And this is important because the ambition and the scope of the NDCs determine the incentive that countries have to ensure the quality of units, right? So these two these two parts on the right-hand side are very connected. Without delving too much into the details, what we know is that countries with an ambitious mitigation target have an incentive to ensure the quality of units that leave the scope of their NDC. This is because emissions are visible in the inventory, and if a country transfers a unit with a face value of 1 ton without incurring into abatement of at least 1 ton within their territory, and assuming, of course, that they're going to comply with their target and that the inventory is complete, then this country with an ambitious target would have to compensate for any unit lacking quality that leaves its territory. But the situation is quite different for countries that have unambitious targets, say targets that are less ambitious than business as usual, and for scopes outside of, sectors outside of the scope of NDCs. Why? Because in this case, countries can transfer units that lack quality without impacting their ability to achieve their NDC. So a country that has a target that is above business as usual can transfer all of that hot air internationally to another country without any negative impact to the selling country, so to speak, achieving its NDC. Similarly, countries could regard, and hopefully they don't, but they could regard sectors outside the scope of NDCs as basically unit printing machines, issuing credits that really have no associated abatement with them. So the fourth bit is incentives for future action, and I think this is very much what you were talking about, the dynamic element of environmental integrity. And here it relates to whether the system incentivizes or disincentivizes countries to move into ambitious mitigation action over time. Carbon markets can reduce the cost of mitigation action, and this is the wonderful thing about them, and they can allow countries to ramp up ambition. But on the other hand, carbon markets allow you to monetize surplus units, and they thereby create a perverse incentive for countries to present unambitious targets or targets that are less ambitious than they could otherwise have been, or to present sectorally limited targets so as to increase the profits from the sale of units. So with these four elements, what we found in our study is that even if we assume that robust accounting and perverse incentives are taken care of, which is a big if, but ride with me, then if in cases where mechanisms do not ensure the quality of all units transferred internationally, so I'm going to repeat, if mechanisms do not ensure the quality of units transferred internationally, then you have a really big problem in situations where NDCs are less ambitious than business as usual and where crediting takes place outside of the scope of NDCs. And this is because in those cases, countries do not have the incentive to ensure the quality of units, and international transfers could very likely lead to an increase in global GHG emissions. So this leads us to looking into the numbers, right? We know we have a problem with hot air. We know we have a problem with off-scope crediting. How does it look like? Now, it turns out the numbers are frighteningly big. The hot air potential in current NDCs only in 2030, according to our calculations, ranges between 2.2 and 3.5 gigatons. This is whopping 22 to 66% of all ambition contained in all targets that are more ambitious than BAU. Yeah, okay, so off-scope crediting We've calculated that about 12 to 14% of all global GHG emissions are not covered by targets. This corresponds to about 6.1 gigatons in 2030. Now, these numbers are frighteningly big, and especially since you consider that this is all only in 2030, right? We're not even considering the 2022-2030 range. The good news, though, is that this is only the maximum theoretical potential. And this damage really will only be realized to the extent that countries purchase those units or receive those units and use them towards achieving their NDCs, which is what takes us to the part on solutions. Now, the solutions I'll cover here really relate mainly to hot air. For off-scope crediting, and very, very briefly, a simple solution could be to have the 6.4 mechanism covering all crediting done outside of the scope of targets, and really making sure that 6.4 can ensure the quality of units issued outside the scope of targets. This relies on the ability of 6.4 doing so, and as we've seen from recent studies on the additionality of the CDM, that is very much not trivial, but could be better than nothing. For hot air, there are solutions inside of UNFCCC system, outside of UNFCCC system, and there are about 1,500,000,000 different solutions we could develop. We can't cover all of them here, but we'll look into some of the representative ones. First, we have the so-called principles plus reporting and review. So the idea here is that parties would develop high-level principles at UNFCCC level, for example, guiding the development of national mechanisms, so nationally developed mechanisms, in order to ensure the quality of units transferred internationally. Countries would then report on these obligations through Article 13, the transparency regime, and would be subject to compliance under Article 15. Now, the advantages here are kind of obvious, right? It's slow regulation, low, simple regulation at international level, and a high level of flexibility for parties to implement the provisions of Article 6. Now, the fundamental disadvantage here is that for this to be effective in addressing hot air, it relies crucially on two things. First, you need to make sure that the provisions of Article 13 actually are able to identify any problems related to hot air and environmental integrity. And it relies on the provisions of Article 15 to actually address any issues that are identified. Now, a strong transparency regime could identify the problems. How effective the facilitative compliance regime of Article 15 would be in addressing ex-post transfers of low-quality units remains to be seen. Another option is to limit the number of ITMOs of units that can be either issued, transferred, or used. Brazil, for example, proposes to create a budget of transferable units, which is calculated on the basis of the ambition of the NDC and on the previous inventories of the country. This is one of the many configurations for limits. There are also very different types of limits. So one of the types of limits that Wolfgang mentioned is the one on supplementarity, which works actually quite differently from this one. The nice thing about limits is that with proper design, limits could provide ex-ante assurance on the prevention of hot air, or at least substantially reduce the amount of damage that can be done. The disadvantage is that they do require quite a bit more of international regulation, and any really robust design of limits could be politically quite challenging to achieve. So looking very, very briefly at possible solutions outside of UNFCCC, many people have been advocating for the use of carbon clubs. Now, carbon clubs are a great thing if you have a high ambition carbon club, right? This is because when you put a lot of countries together, there's an economic incentive to ensure similar levels of ambition, and there you can also have provisions for enforcement. Now, the disadvantage is that you have absolutely no guarantee that carbon clubs will be high ambition, and you can have a low ambition carbon club, which could basically make money out of not complying with environmental integrity and thereby gain a competitive advantage. Green investment schemes are also something we know from KP Times. If green investment schemes were designed like a crediting mechanism, if they were designed like a crediting mechanism and applied universally, they could be really useful in ensuring the quality of units internationally transferred, especially in government-to-government transfers. But anything that is non-universal application would make the usefulness of this tool very limited, basically because you'd only be preaching to the converted and everybody else wouldn't make use of it. Finally, there's also the possibility of political commitments. We do, after all, have a limited number of countries that are interested in buying units nowadays. So these countries could simply politically say, you know, we are not going to buy certain units from certain countries. Now, this could work in the short term, but this is first requiring a lot of political clout. And second, it would also be only a short-term solution. After all, we do want countries to move into higher ambition. We do want countries to progressively become buyers and not sellers. And so this option is also kind of complicated. So the conclusion on solutions for hot air problems is really, really not straightforward. We need to very carefully think about how much ex-ante assurance of hot air prevention we want and need, especially in the context of increasing carbon prices over time. So right now, maybe it's not a problem. Carbon prices are below 10 euro a ton. How does it look when we start getting to the carbon prices we all say we need for real change in our economies? Compromises in the solution, in the design of solutions, could lead to reducing risks rather than preventing them. Could be better than nothing, but then the question is, how much compromising can the atmosphere take? I also have a really big sense of urgency about this. I am not sure whether looking at this problem as a problem we don't need to worry about now because there are not so many buyers right now means that we will miss the opportunity to regulate this. And I don't know if we will have an opportunity to regulate this later on. It's also important to find solutions that prevent hot air transfers without limiting the ability of countries that do have ambitious mitigation targets to trade with each other. And it's also interesting to know that although hot air is not an accounting problem, some of the solutions for the hot air problem can be implemented through accounting provisions. So this is it. The three key messages I wanted to leave you with is that environmental integrity means that Article 6 should not lead to an increase in global GHG emissions, that hot air and crediting outside the scope of NDCs are a really big problem, and that the solutions to these problems really require us to think and balance what is politically possible and what is atmospherically acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. So some scary scenarios and some potential solutions. Coming from the civil society perspective and not being in the room recently, we have limited influence, obviously, but we do have at least a vision from Carbon Market Watch respecting the Sustainable Development Mechanism.
Yeah, thanks, Aki. I will also be lazy and stay sitting. Sorry, not as entertaining. Yes, so now we have heard about Article 6 in general, sustainable development and environmental integrity. And I would like now to focus my presentation more specifically on the Sustainable Development Mechanism itself, so the SDM. And talk about what, some Carbon Market Watch thoughts on what it could look like and more importantly should look like from our perspective. And I will try to keep it very short because also we have some negotiators here, which is great. So I hope also that we can engage in some discussions afterwards. And I would like just to present you some very short recommendations that we have. And on that matter, Carbon Market Watch also just published this policy brief, which is talking exactly about this issue, a surprise. It's called Building Blocks for a Sustainable Development Mechanism. And if you're interested in it, we have some copies with us, and you can also find it online. And I very much hope that you're interested in it. But yeah, just a little spoiler alert, this presentation might tell you a lot about it already. But yeah, still it's good. So Before getting into the specifics, I think it actually is important to take a little bit of a step back, which I will do now. Because when we're talking about Article 6 and the SDM, it needs to be in your mind that this article is not there in isolation. So it does not, it's not just Article 6, but it has to be read in conjunction with other provisions of the Paris Agreement. And some of which are that we have a preamble that makes a reference to human rights and that says that human rights obligations need to be respected and promoted when we have climate action. This is number one. Then we have the effort to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees, whatever you prefer. I hope 1.5. Then we have the goal to decarbonize by mid-century, and we have a sustainable development agenda that was adopted in 2015, and that applies to all countries, and that was explicitly welcomed also by the COP decision accompanying the Paris Agreement. And this again underlines this close interlinkage we have between climate change and climate action and sustainable development. So this is not an exhaustive list, but I think it's very important to keep this in mind. And also when we are trying to build up a mechanism and trying to set it up, that it actually ultimately has to lead towards those frameworks and those goals that were set out in the Paris Agreement itself. So just for you to have this in mind, because I feel this is a very important element. So now, finally coming to the specifics of the SDM that I promised you earlier. In this policy brief, we focused on 3 major building blocks, as we call it, 3 major elements that need to be addressed. Which, for one, is that the SDM needs to increase ambition, and thereby we also kind of challenge the concept of offsets, and if the Sustainable Development Mechanism should be an offset mechanism or not. Then, secondly, how can you ensure that it contributes to environmental integrity and sustainable development? And then thirdly, and last but not least, the need for robust governance. So, and starting with point number 1, as you do, let's talk about higher ambition and the concept of offsets. So the SDM was established as a new market instrument for the period after 2020. And it was set out to be a mechanism that shall contribute to the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and foster sustainable development at the same time. And when we read that, it really sounds very, very similar to what we had under the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM. But I feel there is a very important difference to this. Namely that the SDM has the more specific and more concrete goal to deliver an overall mitigation in global emissions. And I think this is really the key sentence that we have to focus on here, because this means that when you're using the SDM, you have to achieve emission reductions that would not have occurred otherwise, and also that when using the SDM, it cannot correspond in increased emissions elsewhere. So where does it lead us? Here we should have a look at the CDM again. So the logic of the CDM was that 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions has the same global warming effect no matter where you emit it in the world or in what area. And this basically means that there was just a shifting of emissions rather than an overall reduction. And now, so just to underline this one more time, offsetting ultimately is a shifting of emissions, not contributing to an overall emission reduction. And now this is why I wanted to paint the bigger picture in the beginning. Now, when we look at this framework, we want to achieve 1.5 degrees, we want to decarbonize. It is evident that there needs to be a massive increase in ambition than what we had before. And sectors need to rapidly contribute to emission reductions. And so, from our point of view, it kind of becomes evident that the concept of offsetting, so shifting rather than contributing to overall emission reductions, is not the way to go anymore. Because given the remaining carbon budget we have, we feel that there is more urgent action needed, and offsetting is not, there's no space for it anymore. So our recommendation is that the SDM should rather be designed as a tool for results-based finance, not offsetting. And so, yeah, to mobilize private and public finance for more action, and also what is a important element in it is that this action needs to be additional, so that technologies and project types with a low likelihood of additionality, as we have seen from experience with the CDM, should be excluded and should not be eligible for it. So this is building block number 1, increasing ambition and not designing the SDM as a tool for offsetting. Coming to my second point, which is talking about sustainable development and environmental integrity. I think we heard a lot about sustainable development already from Karen, which was really good. And so just to mention again that sustainable development is very prominently featured really in the Paris Agreement. We have it mentioned in the preamble, in Article 2. We have the COP decision that welcomes the Sustainable Development Agenda, as I just said. And I really feel that the Sustainable Development Agenda is a very key element that we need to focus on, because it recognizes that solutions to climate change and sustainable development are very closely connected and need to be addressed simultaneously. So what we had in the problems that we have seen with the CDM was that there was really like a national prerogative to define what is sustainable development. And now that we have the SDGs as a tool at hand, we feel that this really should be a foundation for the SDM and to be integrated there. And we also have a very similar reading to what Karen said earlier on, that talking about that it should be real, measurable and long-term benefits that are achieved does not just apply for emission reductions, but also for sustainable development. So again, here underlying that emission reductions and sustainable development are equally important when we're talking about the SDM. So, and that those sustainable development benefits are, again, I repeat it, are real, measurable and long-term, and also should be clearly defined using the SDGs that we have, be measured, reported and verified. And so this is building block 2.1, if you wish so. And then on environmental integrity. As a minimum, we understand that environmental integrity, so the mitigation benefits, again, should be real, measurable and long-term, and that they should also contribute to overall mitigation of global emissions. This, again, also read in conjunction with the provisions that I highlighted earlier on. We want to achieve 1.5 degrees, and there should be decarbonization by mid-century, which again leads us to the vision or the idea that there should be no perverse incentives created by the SDM. So it should go way beyond business as usual, which will effectively exclude certain technologies and project types, for example, locking in fossil fuels. This is building block number 2, and now coming to governance. Which is a very important element also for ensuring integrity of the SDM in the long run. We have a lot of lessons that we can learn from the CDM, and I will just, I forgot to click, nobody told me. We feel there are some key elements that need to be integrated in the SDM, which are ensuring effective public and local stakeholder participation, establishing an institutional grievance mechanism, because also recalling the preamble that calls for promoting and respecting human rights when we are implementing climate action. And the grievance mechanism is basically really a crucial opportunity to operationalize this language and to address community-based grievances before they even dispute. Then we would like to see a robust SDM oversight body building on the experiences with the CDM board, but here also ensuring that there's a transparent nomination and selection process for board members, and that there's also some civil society participation. And then, also building on what we had from the CDM with regards to designated national, authorities, thank you, DNAs. The one time you don't want to use an acronym. And DOEs, but I leave it there, so that we can build on those again. So because we feel that this is really something very valuable that we can take from the CDM. So I would just like to leave you with this now here, and I hope it was clear that we have really like this increasing ambitions, not having an offset mechanism anymore, guaranteeing environmental integrity and sustainable development, and ensuring robust governments, that these are the key elements that we see for an integral and robust sustainable development mechanism.
Great, thank you, Jules. And just cognizant of the fact that Andrea has a meeting soon to go to, if we could get an initial reaction from you.
Yeah, and I apologize, but I've been called in the G77 meeting, so I do have to go, and I apologize for that. It's not my, I organize quite a few meetings in my life and currently, and it's just not a nice thing to do, so I apologize for that. And I was asking MJ, are we making a speech or are we reacting? And I'll react because I think that time only allows for that. Look, I actually like the Kyoto Protocol. I think it was perfectly fine, and it was not a problem. It added up and up and down, and we knew what we traded and knew what the AUs were and the CERs, and they were all denominated in 1 ton, and everything was fine. So we now have the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement is the reality. So there are certain realities that we have to take home, and that are, we're not here to renegotiate the Paris Agreement. There are certain realities that are in the Paris Agreement, and not only that they are in Paris Agreement, but there is a certain history that some of us who negotiated that are aware of. Now, you have 2 schools of thoughts. One of them is you've negotiated something and you have history, and the other school of thought is tough luck. You negotiated something, there's ambivalence, and it's good for anything goes. It depends. I'm on the former school. I think that what the founding fathers, they're all dead now, of the US Constitution, you can't tell. But what the people who negotiated the Paris Agreement can still talk because they're around here and kicking. So we have very clearly in Paris, in my own mind, subscribed to a few principles. And one of them is that this, by and large, the ethos of this agreement is a bottom-up agreement. That's the general ethos. It's not the governance. It's not that the governance is either centralized or centralized. And people talk about top-down and bottom-up. The fact of the matter is neither the Kyoto Protocol was top-down or bottom-up, but this is not about how top-down or bottom-up is. What is the governance? And in the Paris Agreement, when in error, I think in general the agreement seems to be to indicate, if you are there, that this was more of a bottom-up decentralized government. It's not necessary, it's always true, but that is the general direction. Having said this, we made a clear, at least in my mind, decision. Maybe I don't like it, maybe I like it, but I'm a negotiator and I have to respect it, is that we gave options to parties. And one option is those parties that wish to have a centralized governance under the blue flag with the blue stamp on the credits will use 6.4. And that is perfectly fine, it's fully understood, and how it's going to be developed is going to have a preponderance of centralized governance, not a 100% centralized governance, but a preponderance of centralized governance. 6.2 at the same time was clearly the option that was given to parties to do things bilaterally or small multilaterally. The governance was not multilateral, it was small plurilateral or bilateral. Again, there will be elements in here that will be somewhat more centralized, and accounting is one of them. But by and large, when in doubt, that is the principle that you will. The second principle that I believe in doing this is that the Paris Agreement is unitary, and Article 6 doesn't live on its own. Article 6 is somewhere within the Paris Agreement, and it needs to be thought of in conjunction with the other articles. And the three pieces or 4 pieces of Article 6 were not put together there because we ran out of numbers, and we didn't want to create Article 7. Because those people who wrote this and approved it and signed them, it was some way above my pay grade, thought that there was a commonality. So there's got to be some commonality between all these things that we think of. So having said all this, a few comments that I picked up from some of the things that were said here. One of them is the issue of corresponding adjustment for outside NDCs. I don't think there's anything in the Paris Agreement that says that you cannot have 6.4 outside NDCs. I do not read anything like that. I do not see anything that would indicate to me that way. The fact that you do have, that you have a principle which we subscribe to, that you cannot do damage in the sense of increase the overall emissions as a result of a mitigation action under 6.2 or 6.4 being transferred, that's clear. But that is also the principle that you do have, you could potentially have a very much a CDM-like behavior with something outside an NDC that is then being used by another party to meet its NDC compliance. Now, I think there's also a problem of language here, because people talk about offsetting. Let's be very clear, CDM was not an offsetting tool. CDM was never an offsetting tool. CDM was was a credit baseline and credit tool, and parties decided to use it as an offsetting tool, maybe if they so chose to. But there's nothing that obliged the European Union to take a CER and use it at the face value of 1. The European Union could have easily made a decision that a CER was worth 0.5 tons. Nobody stopped them that. So let's not call this an offsetting mechanism, a baseline and credit mechanism, and parties decide how they will use it. Now, the one thing that's important to us, because I represent the G77 country, and that is a almost non-negotiable topic, is the fact that sustainable development is a national prerogative. And it's not about yes, maybe, but, or I don't know what. It is clear. And we don't say that in negative. It is because I think that if you do otherwise, this concept of sustainable development will lose credibility rapidly and will be used, and many will see it in developing countries as being used as a tool for domination and imposing a certain behavior, technologies and other things like that. That does not mean that we do not subscribe to the fact that under the Paris Agreement, we have a set of NDCs which are then in conjunction with transparency provisions. And those of us countries that will use sustainable development treatment that does not correspond to the norm, international norm, will pay the price that there is to pay. And I think that's quite clear, and there's no doubt about that. Now, with respect to the environmental integrity, listen, I think that environmental integrity for 6.4 is quite a clear thing. It will be under the auspices of the CMA and the supervisory body. There's no doubt about that, and they will define the way they define it. I think once you get into Article 6.2, it becomes a problem. And the problem is that if you indeed think that you're going to pierce the national veil, meaning that you're going to go to the source of your emission mitigation outcomes that you transfer, then what you do is essentially you will start affecting the NDC. And the NDC is nationally determined by definition. So if you start to come and talk that you don't like certain things because it's hot air, and I don't know what hot air is, I actually object to that word, then you will tell people, you start telling countries that their NDC is not appropriate, and then the whole concept of NDC collapses. I may or may not like it. This is not a personal view, and I'm not here. I was invited by Carbon Market Watch and ACI as a representative of the country that's given me a badge. And as such, this is what the position has to be. It is a nationally determined contribution. I can go into a long presentation about mitigation values and all these kind of things, and how you can pervert the transfer by having a face value of a unit when you transfer it to another country and being used in another country with a different compliance value. But the easy way to do that, you put a cap at the face value of what were issued. There are many, many ways. At the same time, we are not here to recreate Article 17, and we know there are submissions that propose that 6.2 behave like Article 17 and kind of start creating budgets, QLROs, QCUs that are similar to AAUs. I think that it's a simplifying assumption that are not bad, but I believe personally that they will change the fundamental nature of the bottom-up approach of Article 6.2. So we as a parties elected in Paris that we will make a mess out of it, and we made a mess out of it because it is now very much about transparency and trust and so on, and it's going to be very complicated, but that is the political reality of what was chosen. And those parties that don't want that can go to Article 6.4. They will get credits stamped with a blue flag on it, and there will be many countries that's what they want. There will be many, many countries that feel secure because of the strong civil society, because of whatever it is. Now, political commitment, let me tell you something about political commitment. When we started in this business, and I'll finish here, Aki, because somebody's waiting for me at 6. When we started in this business, we were complying with gold standard CERs. Then we complied, as things got bad in the financial crisis, we were complying with CRs. Then with GIS, AAU GIS, JI and GIS, and in the end they complied with AAUs. Any AAUs for any country you want, because time got tough. So the political commitment, I think that's a tough one to believe. But certainly, I believe that the transparency provision in the Paris Agreement, if this House is to stand, is what is really important, and that's what we have to make very, very strong, because otherwise the whole Paris Agreement doesn't have a leg to stand on. That is the fundamental basis of the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andre. So the Paris Agreement is a mess, and we have to depend on the bottom-up approach to guarantee environmental integrity. Thank you for that sobering reality check from some parties in the room. MJ? And I've not been terribly good with time management. I don't want to be unjust, but about 5 minutes.
That's fine. Hi, thanks for inviting me. My name's MJ Mays. I'm a negotiator for St. Lucia. St. Lucia, in case there's any confusion, St. Lucia is part of CARICOM, which is a grouping of 14 Caribbean island countries, but then, of course, CARICOM is a subset of AOSIS, which is a grouping of some 43 small island states. So that's, I guess, the perspective from which I'm involved. I've also, just for a little background, had the pleasure and the privilege of trying to work on some of the difficult issues around hot air in the Kyoto Protocol negotiations. So I can tell you that was exceedingly unpleasant. It was a good time. Right, moving along. I think one of the challenges for AOSIS, certainly in that context, was trying to make sure that we didn't see the erosion of the targets that parties had taken through opportunistic use of loopholes, whatever, but basically making sure that the rule set we had didn't bring out the worst in I'm not going to finish that sentence, actually. I'm just going to not finish that sentence. But so we had lots of difficult issues to deal with. We had, surplus that everybody wanted to carry over, and we had to figure out whether we would use the same limits or whether we could be more stringent. We had the whole Article 3.7 debate around trying to manage parties whose ambition really was not very ambitious. So I had to deal with those sorts of challenges. And it was, I think one lesson hard learned from that entire process is that once you have a set of rules in place and people are invested in hanging on to units, it's really, really hard to change those rules. And it's really, really hard to repossess units once they're out there. And I think that's an important lesson for this entire discussion. And the reason it's important is because you can discuss these issues in the abstract, but I think you have to keep in mind that really you're dealing with parties that have very strong national interests and national circumstances and a lot of competing demands. So it's an interesting intellectual exercise, but it's also a real political quagmire. So it's a very interesting overlay, the one on top of the other. so going from this very sort of clear system we had under the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement world is a really challenging shifting, from one horse to the next. I wouldn't say that everything is bottom up and it's all a mess. If that's the flavor that you got from Andre, it's easy to get that flavor from Andre. But I think it's important to appreciate that we're really at the beginning, of establishing the rule set for the Paris Agreement, and the same issues that we've had to sort out first in the convention and then the protocol. We're really at the beginning of that process. We're missing some of the tools that really. Who am I now? Do I have a new name tag now? That'd be so exciting. But all the same issues that played out in the KP, they're all playing out again here. But the problem is we don't have some of the architecture is not yet in place that enables some of these very tidy discussions. I mean, we're still talking about things like features and information and account. We're still trying to get to the bottom of what this array of NDC types delivers when you put it into the context of market-based mechanisms, which means really just even trying to break down NDCs into their component parts so you can reconstruct a system on top of that. The reality is everybody wants to be able to play in the new game, but not everybody yet has the tools and the reporting systems, and the opportunities to do so. So again, it's that juggling of the real political reality, and then the notion of opportunity, I suppose, that's afforded by Article 6 mechanisms. So it's like, even for example, just to use the example of inside and outside the scope of NDCs and whether there should be corresponding adjustments. You can have a tidy debate around beautiful accounting, but then some parties want to make sure that opportunities outside the scope of NDCs aren't lost to investment and aren't lost to host countries to be sought out as opportunities to find mitigation opportunities that could maybe later be migrated into NDC. So they're just, I guess my point is, there are arguments on both sides of almost every issue, and we're also quite at the beginning. And in developing the rule set, I think one of the challenges is in making sure that the principles that we have agreed in the Paris Agreement really guide, let me put it that way, really guide the development of the rule set. So when we talk about progression, we have to make sure we don't get in the way of progression through the rule set we establish for markets. When we talk about countries moving toward economy-wide targets, we have to make sure we don't create disincentives or perverse incentives that prevent countries or get in the way of countries trying to be more aspirational in the scope of the NDCs that they take over time. But again, I want to say we're still at the beginning of this. I mean, we haven't yet even established common timeframes for NDCs or common GWPs. We said we'll have common elements, but we haven't sorted it all out yet. So we're at an early phase, I guess, is the point. So regaining the information base to even have this kind of disciplined conversation, we're not even quite there yet. And then, of course, bringing more countries on board, that's very important, because bringing countries into the trading system under the KP actually improved the MRV that those countries had in place, and that was a benefit to the entire process. Can we do that with getting more countries engaged? I think, specifically with respect to offsetting and going beyond offsetting, that's obviously an interest that's of strong interest to AOSIS. The submission that we made on this issue speaks to how the system should be engineered to ensure the delivery of an overall mitigation in global emissions, going beyond offsetting through the cancellation of a percentage of the reductions that are verified prior to transfer. It gets technical, but basically we're interested in trying to make sure that when we establish the rule set for 6.4 and for Article 6 as a whole, that we don't lose the opportunity to create tools that will work over time. Knowing what we've already learned the hard way, that once you have a rule set, it is very, very hard to change that rule set. We just certainly had that, we've had that experience in the CDM review discussions. It's a lesson hard learned. But so I think the idea is, if you can get the rules right the first time, life will be an awful lot easier. So I think all these lessons that Stephanie and others have listed are very instructive there. Big pitfalls and the challenge is how to avoid them. But I do want to recommend all the papers for your reading pleasure. Every single one of the papers that's been mentioned has actually got a real wealth of information. I certainly have enjoyed reading them.
Thank you. Very happy to hear that from the small island states, some of the most vulnerable to climate change. And Sven, you have closing remarks.
Thank you. I'm here for Liechtenstein. We are part of the Environmental Integrity Group, Mexico, Korea, Switzerland, Monaco, and Liechtenstein. I hope I did not forget. And we have worked in our submissions on positions on sustainable development and environmental integrity. I want to keep it close. I just wanted to make one quick point on how to deal with sustainable development in the context of Article 6.2. Because for us, for our group, 6.2 is an open flank, which has some risks really towards the ensuring sustainable development and environmental integrity. I will focus only on sustainable development here because, as Andre already mentioned, the buzzword here is a national prerogative. We don't question that. Of course, the host country is the best to deal with it and to decide on what is best for their development. On the other hand, what we don't want to see in any case is windmills on coral reefs or hydros that kill all fishes or let's say afforestation project that only took place after chopping some rainforests. So and we don't want these projects to carry the UNFCCC label. So when we look at it 6.2, there's the challenge of the bilateral relation or the bilateral bottom-up character between seller and buyer, and we cannot ignore the national prerogative. So what we see, or what Liechtenstein and what we also discuss in our group, is to bring sustainable development on this level in the relation between the seller and the buyer country, for example. I mean, it can also be corporations. Is to bring it to the attention of the buyer. The buyer needs to incorporate certain standards. Certain standards in relation to social and environmental responsibilities. How is that done? Well, we have to do some out-of-the-box thinking. Inform the national parliaments of buyer countries, the shareholders of the companies. This could be a way to go along and ensure sustainable development. Unfortunately, as I see the negotiation going now, to really ensure it by international rules or guidance is tricky, if not impossible. But we will not give up, right? Yeah.
Very glad to hear that. We have a few moments for questions. I think I'll collect the questions and then let them respond as a group. There are no pressing questions, and we are finishing in about 3 minutes. I would suggest taking the discussion on further after the event. Okay, thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to come and approach us. We have a couple of copies of our briefing here as well. Thank you.
Yes, also that even the I don't know if you remember, but 1 year ago I wrote my bachelor thesis in the Bar Blanco project. Yes, and I just saw that you're here exactly then to this. And I thought, oh, I should come here. How did it go? And it went well. I mean, I had a hard time actually. I didn't. In the beginning, I didn't. Yeah, it was difficult with the policies that were developed. But it went out fine. I accepted in the end. So what are you doing now? I'm doing a master here at the United Nations. Oh wow! Yes, in environmentalist. Yeah, and I started in October, and we got access to the time course. Yeah. So I'm just starting to come here and like. Oh, what are you? But I still have the impression that I have to get to know the system because I really don't. So hopefully. And right now I'm understanding that I don't understand anything of the system. It is very and like every time you have the feeling there's new acronyms and whatnot. It's getting more complex. And I'm also at the moment I'm really in this period where I have to find like in which position I am. Because also my bachelor thesis was so critical about the CDM position. And then I had like things to study at the end and I thought, should I not? I don't just shit on it. Yeah, exactly. And now I'm here like as a first year like this. It's not a bad idea actually. Yeah. I tried to. Yeah, so I'm just looking like how our perspectives are, but also like where different views on the topic and stuff. I'm really interested like what are you doing here? And we're also critical of how are your possibilities here to really I mean the most I guess the best application is to
Sorry, I came back late.
because also the negotiation, I don't know if you saw this, but like 5 to 6 months. That's always like a tricky issue. Engaging with all the people that are here, then you need to